Okay, guys, so this week we're starting out talking about performance theory and kind of breaking down the elements that Richard Schechner discusses in his work to sort of think through how performance theory and performance in general can kind of encourage our conversations about activism and politics and identity, and all these sort of ideas are inherent to this course. Performance theory becomes a really powerful tool, especially if you haven't sort of been familiar with it before, to use to kind of think about some of these ideas and constructs. And then I'm going to give you some examples of performance artists as well, so that you can kind of see where I'm building off of. Some of this might be review for some of you, while others, maybe you haven't talked about performance theory before, but it's super valuable to sort of talking about constructs of society and sort of what things are invented through culture and through behavior versus what's sort of real and tangible. So as we look at Richard Schechner, he's one of the big sort of early scholars of performance studies, and he writes this book. It's kind of like a textbook in some ways. It kind of asks you questions at the end of each chapter. But he, as well as Victor Turner, who we'll talk about in a little bit, developed sort of performance theory and start helping to encourage departments to take it on. So while they don't invent performance and performance studies necessarily in the sense that all these artists in the 60s or 70s are doing that, they start putting down into words sort of what this idea is. So, and he tells you right away, he is a white Jewish man, and so you have to take everything that he says with a grain of salt. His point of view comes from a very particular perspective, and he says he has an opinion, so this is not unbiased, but he starts to break down some of these ideas. So what are some of the main points discussed by Richard Schechner in Performance Studies and Introduction 2002 in chapter 1 and 2? So for this class, I've kind of divided the sections of the argument into 4 sections. A lot of his conversations kind of go back and forth, and you have the different scholars and text boxes that he introduces, which is great and interesting, but I've sort of organized it here in the presentation to sort of give you some clarity about some of the ideas. So the first one is the development of performance theory and ideas. What is performance and performance theory? Second, performance in everyday life, performance in art history, and then what is not performance and what is not performance art, which he discusses at the end of chapter 2, I believe. And then the fourth, which is the performance of activism. So what happens in the development of sort of performance theory? And Schechner takes us all the way back to Plato and the allegory of the cave. And maybe you do or don't have some familiarity with this idea, but in this sort of story, our idea by Plato, called the allegory of the cave, Plato describes a group of people who have lived chained to the wall of a cave their whole lives, facing the blank wall. So here they are right here. And these people watch the shadows on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them. They start to give name to the shadows. They see that as the only sort of sense of knowledge and idea and life that they have. So whatever sort of goes in this roadway is then projected onto the wall, and that is sort of their experience. And it becomes their reality. And Socrates even explains how a philosopher is like a prisoner who is free from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall are not reality at all, for he can perceive the true form of reality. And so when these inmates are released and they go into sort of real life, they don't really desire to leave this reality because it's the only thing that they know. And if they leave, it's not what they've expected. So people sort of everyday life, of everyday individuals, are these people in the cave. And Plato believed that philosophers and people become sort of enlightened would come out of the cave and sort of realize that it's not reality. It's sort of this fiction, versus other people are more willing to sort of accept the sort of fiction of the lives of the shadows playing in front of them and what people believe. So Plato also, however, distrusted theater. He didn't really think theater was important because it appealed more to emotions than reason, versus Aristotle, who did believe in sort of emotion and reason, emotion and theater. So thinking about sort of society as the cave, the sort of performance of these people You can also think of like the Matrix. That's also a really good analogy for how people sort of understand and see their lives, is that some people are willing to kind of go on with their lives and not sort of critically think about all of these complex ideas, versus other people want to leave the cave and explore and see what life is really about. So traditionally, when we think about theater and performance, you think of a stage performance in which you have the people on the stage and the audience, and they're kind of separate entirely. They don't really have any connection to one another. They're sort of completely different entities as a whole. So like the book mentioned Shakespeare and the idea of Shakespeare in the Globe Theater, which usually has a little more interaction between the audience members and the people on stage, but also still sort of a separation between time periods and ideas and the way people talk. Schechner also mentions Shakespeare in talking about all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, and they have their exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. So As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7. So Schechner was referencing this quote by Shakespeare and sort of his idea as well, about people being sort of actors in their own lives and sort of create this performance. Maybe traditionally you think more of a musical, like Saturday Night Fever. These are sort of the traditional ideas of performance and theater that we think about when we think about performance as a whole. So with the development of performance studies, you have sort of these ideas and constructs starting to build up. Schechner mentions a couple of different texts that are really important. So Lacan, Bateson, Goffman, and then J.L. Austin, who we're going to talk about in the 60s. You have other constructs that they bring up, like Indian ideas about maya-lila. I've included a link on our page because Richard Schechner has some videos where he discusses some of these things. He's so interesting to listen to. And so you can hear his idea about maya-lila because he explains it better than I do. But we have scholars coming up and sort of building performance ideas about everyday life and how they sort of define performance scholarship. So with J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words from 55 to 62, he talks about the idea of performative utterances or performatives. And this is where a performance is more about language. So performing an action with words. So it's not true or false, but rather performances, or also called speech acts. So a wedding is a really good example. I have Kim Kardashian back here with Chris Humphries or whatever wedding lasted like 75 days, or marriage, in which you doing a particular act is sort of a concrete performative action. So I take this man to be my lawfully married husband is sort of a promise, a decree, a performative, in that it creates and does something specific. So sort of binds you to that person. Here, like the naming of a ship, giving something to a loved one, ending someone's job. So these performances become these sort of concrete performative actions where you do something in particular. So Richard Schechner and Victor Turner start to sort of develop performance theories starting in the 60s and 70s. Schechner publishes the book, or the article that is, Approaches to Theory and Criticism, and starts to sort of develop performance ideas, and comes in contact with Victor Turner. He dies in 83, unfortunately, but he is an anthropologist. And so together they sort of combine performances and anthropology to sort of start these conversations about what performance theory is, after they start to see these artists really producing performance art. I love that Peggy Fallon sort of says that she's skeptical about two men, quote unquote, giving birth to this artistic movement. But here you have them sort of developing different departments and creating sort of performance theory. And Victor Turner, he's an interesting figure on his own because he was very much interested in the study of rituals in Africa. And so that has problems on its own, but sort of not a conversation for today. But he's really well known for sort of documenting ritual processes and structures in African cultures. So the development of performance theory really starts to develop right after, in the 60s and 70s, after the start of minimalism, conceptual art, and process art, as well as land art. Performance studies came into existence because of the radically changed intellectual and artistic landscape emerging during the last third of the 20th century. Combined with the dissatisfaction with the status quo was an explosion of knowledge and a new means of distributing knowledge via the internet. So you have sort of intersectionality and interdisciplinary, where all of these kind of different disciplines are coming together to build performance theory. So not only anthropology and sort of Schechner with his performance studies, but also feminist studies, gender studies, psychoanalysis, queer theory, semiotics, etc. And so performance theory and theorists refuse to sort of get their act together and sort of decide on one particular idea or development of performance theory because it's so full of so many ideas and mediums that they didn't want to sort of limit its potential. Performance studies is open, multivocal, and self-contradictory. So with that, you have, if you're not sort of familiar, I'm going to give you here a glance at some of this work. So with sort of the movement into the avant-garde, with minimalism, with all these different artistic movements, like minimalism with Dan Flavin and Donald Judd, you have conceptual art with Joseph Kosuth, Robert Barry, Hans Hock, where all of these different things are occurring. All of these different movements and ideas are occurring, such as conceptual art and process art, that really kind of lead us into performance theory and performance art. You also have process art like Richard Long, as well as land art, Michael Heiser, Robert Smithson, Anna Mendieta. So with the development of performance theory and thinking about process art, conceptual art, we have Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, who says, do not look as a specific medium when studying performance. To study performance as an art form that lacks a distinctive medium and hence uses any and all media requires attending to all modalities in play. So you see these avant-garde artists, like land art, like process art, like conceptual arts, and then performance artists working towards a dematerialization of the art object. So completely moving away from a physical art object that can be commodified and sold in museum culture, embodying practice and event at the core, but doesn't have to only be that. So this is sort of a big part of performance theory as well, and the development of it. I just love this quote by Peggy Fallon, who says, a new discipline just in time to commemorate a dead art would be keeping with the necrophilia of much of academic practice. So what is performance and performance theory? How do we define it? How do we look at it in sort of the broader realm? And what are sort of some of the key points and ideas behind it? So there are a lot of different ways you can look at performance and performance theory, and you'll sort of feel maybe by Richard Schechner's chapters that there is innumerable ways to define what performance is. So performances are sort of inherently actions. So it becomes behavior as object of study, usually in sort of anthropological studies or studies of artists. You're looking at their work or photographs or journals. Instead, sort of, though that does happen in performance theory, with performances that don't occur again, we're also looking at what people are doing and how they do it. Artistic practice is a big part of performance studies, and many scholars are also artists and practicing artists. Anthropological study of participant observation. So you have someone performing field work and recording. In anthropology, usually there's yourself, and then there's your sort of other, which is the group that you're studying. In performance, other can be a lot of different things. So they can be something you're critiquing, the culture, other can be the audience. So other can be defined in a very different way in performance. Performance is also involved in social practices and advocacies, but there is no such thing as a neutral or unbiased opinion. So the challenge is to become aware as possible of one's own stances in relation to the position of others, and then take steps to maintain or change positions. So Schechner gives us a couple of different charts to kind of look at, to break down some of these ideas involving anthropology and sort of how we think about performance as a whole. He also lists 8 kinds of performances in everyday life: cooking, socializing, just living, in the arts, in sports and other popular entertainments, in business and technology, in sex, in ritual, and in play. So these things probably seem relatively familiar to you, like in business, when you're asked to perform or have a performance review, they're kind of rating how well you're quote unquote performing in your job. Performance is also intrinsically linked with social studies. You can think about these things as well. So some of the same kind of ideas with performance of everyday life and sports, ritual, and play. Also various modes of communication and symbiotics, right? Symbols are a very important part of performance, as symbols don't always carry across all cultures. You have aspects of psychotherapy and person-to-person interaction, ethnography, and history. We're also going to talk about the Western perspective as well, and then the constitution of unified theories of performance, which are in fact theories of behavior. So some of the functions of performance: to entertain, to make something that is beautiful, to mark or change identity, to make or foster community, to heal, to teach, persuade, or convince, and to deal with sacred or the demonic. So I think some of the most important parts of performance and the function of performance are often to sort of change identity, to think about something changing, to try to teach, persuade, convince, and sort of change society's views of something. So Schechner discusses some other functions of performance and kind of gives you examples to kind of work off of. So a street demonstration or propaganda play may be mostly about teaching, persuading, and convincing. A doctor's bedside manner is a performance of encouragement, teaching, and healing. A Broadway musical will entertain but little else. Also, as a comment, these numbers do mean the page numbers that I'm referencing in a quote. So Schechner brings up model operas and the Cultural Revolution of China, in that Jiang Qing, who was the wife of Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution, helped to produce these model operas, which were sort of these little pieces of music and performance that were supposed to give sort of an idea of what was happening in the Cultural Revolution. It was supposed to change people's minds, kind of a type of propaganda that was encouraging people to support the Cultural Revolution. So while they're still performed today and people still watch them, they do not support the Cultural Revolution in China anymore, so now they're kind of used as escapism, even though some people do condemn them, which is really interesting, and definitely something to look into if you really think is interesting and valuable. It's something you can write about, but now they're sort of used for entertainment purposes, whereas before they were used by the Cultural Revolution to try to influence people to support the cause at the time, which was killing a lot of different people. So this really struck me, which was really crazy. And I don't know if Schechner is just kind of speaking out of personal experience, but he says a Broadway musical will entertain but little else, which is crazy for someone who spends so much time kind of breaking down these ideas and thoughts about entertainment and performance. And I believe that not to be true. I think that a lot of Broadway musicals have sort of different types of themes and performances that create kind of different ideas. So like, for example, when you watch Hamilton, if you guys have seen, obviously became super popular on Disney Plus during the summer, and I've watched like a million times by now. A play like Hamilton can influence people in a specific way, especially as you have founding fathers being played by non-white figures, and sort of supporting this narrative, but also thinking about sort of these contradictions and bringing up a lot of issues with women's rights and what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, etc. So I don't really agree with Schechner on that point at all. So this is a great quote by Carol Simpson Stern and Bruce Henderson about the function of performance. The term performance incorporates a whole field of human activity. It embraces a verbal act in everyday life or a stage play, a rite of invective play in urban streets, a performance in Western traditions of high art, or work of performance art. It includes cultural performances, such as the personal narrative of folk and fairy tales, or more communal forms of ceremony, like the National Democratic Convention, which happened in Milwaukee this year, but more online than in person, obviously. An evensong vigil march for the people with AIDS, Mardi Gras, or a bullfight. In all cases, a performance act, interactional in nature and involving symbolic forms and living bodies, provides a way to constitute meaning and to affirm individual and cultural values. So throughout Schechner's book, he spends a lot of time kind of breaking down these ideas and thinking about the different ways that performance can be seen sort of in a broader spectrum, in ritual and play, sports, popular entertainments, performing arts like theater, dance, and music, and everyday life performances to enactment of social, professional, gender, race, and class roles. The underlying notion is that any action that is framed, presented, highlighted, or displayed is a performance. And then he spends these chapters with these like little blocks that you see, which are actually really helpful to break this idea down. So performance in everyday life is a really big part of this performance text and kind of applies to a lot of different areas and ideas that we're going to be talking about this semester. In chapter 2, he spends a lot of time sort of talking about performance in everyday life and kind of trying to give you examples to sort of see how you connect with that material. So, he gives different examples like business, sports, sex. To perform is to do something up to standards, succeed, excel. In arts, to perform is to put on a show or play or dance or concert. We have Bill Parcells' advertisement from 1999, which is a very interesting sort of comparison because here's this kind of old school ad. I'm sorry for the bad quality. Apparently, I cannot find this ad. I had to scan it out of the book with my phone. But the ad conflates performance in sports, business, sex, arts, and technology. It's saying that this car is at the top of its game, is sexy and powerful, well made, down to the last detail, just like the sort of leader of the football league at the time. So this is supposed to be sort of sexy and powerful, and then matched in the car. Now, obviously, you may not get that right now. Not necessarily something you might personally feel about this advertisement for of Bill Parcells. He's not necessarily some like sexy dude. But you get the kind of idea in advertising with sort of using sexual female figures, etc. Performance mark identities, bend time, and reshape and adorn the body and tell stories. He also gives the baby metaphor, which kind of gives you an idea of how different people perform with trying to feed the baby and taking a video, and then people going on to watch the video later in life. All this type of performance of just simply like sort of feeding the baby different foods. What's really integral to understanding sort of performance and performance theory, especially in everyday life, is this twice behaved behaviors. So in fact, the everydayness of everyday life is precisely its familiarity. It's being built from known bits of behavior, rearranged and shaped in order to suit specific circumstances. Every day is a ritual activity of reenacting previously learned behavior, but everyday life also involves years of training, of learned appropriate bits of behavior, of finding out how to adjust and perform one's life in relation to social and personal circumstances. And then you have sort of these ideas, right, that if you continue to perform the way people want you to, you're quote unquote successful in sort of adult life, right? And you can imagine that even in society, if you perform in a way that is outside of the norm, people start to ridicule you and give you a hard time and treat you like you're different or less. And then you would see that, right, as quote unquote unsuccessful, right, where people start to treat you like you don't matter, right? And that's sort of the problem. Performance sort of brings up those issues and says, well, those things aren't necessarily true, like performance theory, that there isn't such a black and white way of defining how people live and function. It's also the fact that things can never be done that are original, right? every bit of behavior is recombined in endless variations. Even if you have a performance or a theater act, or a theater performance, or any of the performances that we just talked about, even if you do the same thing every day, it's always different. Maybe in a performance, they perform the same play every night, but the audience is different, right? Or the reaction, or maybe an actor messes up his line. So every day, every single thing is a twice behaved behaviors, because all of them are built from previous behavior that has already existed. So Schechner discusses these two sort of separate ideas of make-believe and make-belief, and they're kind of drawn from theater as well. Make-believe being sort of the clear distinctions between reality and pretend, right? If you're participating in sort of make-believe, right, you're pretending to be a different character or reenacting a story, versus make-belief, which is sort of the intentional blurring of that boundary. So having to do with performance and things that are performed that are just part of sort of norms in general. So playing professional roles, gender and race roles, as well as shaping one's identity as a whole. So a little later in this semester, we'll be talking about Judith Butler. I was just about to call her Judith Schechner. Judith Butler, who talks about the performance of gender and how it's sort of this inherent part of performance and performance theory, because gender roles are not made up sort of just out of the blue because they relate to each sex, and it makes perfect sense, right? And girls can wear only skirts because it's part of their gender, right? All of that is built upon social norms and ideas that have occurred over centuries, and thus gender in itself is a performance. Another great example that Schechner uses is the president, right? The president has sort of his way of performing, and so like signing bills, having events, everything is sort of is scripted, and they have to behave in a very particular way. He was giving examples. I think the little image is like Clinton, which is hard to tell, but you can think about the way the president performs in the White House, and he's supposed to appear doing certain things, and then you have sort of the public appearances and the script that they're supposed to read, what's sort of important for them. And something interesting that I thought about with a quote by Schechner was, with so many kinds of performance on view, people are sophisticated and suspicious demonstrators of the theatrical technique deployed to lure them, which I think is really interesting because there's so much going out there that even when you read a fact, right, you read a fact about the coronavirus, you read a fact about Donald Trump, that people ultimately claim that it's fake news if it is negative against him. So is it that people now are sophisticated and suspicious, or is that we've gone over that and now we're super suspicious of the media? We don't believe anything we read, because as a scholar, as artists, right, we have to somehow believe certain types of sources and information. If it's scholarly, if it's published by a valuable source, we have to be able to rely on those sources to give us the information that we need. And if we are so suspicious of everything and don't believe everything, that becomes problematic, right? You can fight against ideas with your own facts, your own information, but that's different than just sort of declaring something to be real or not real. So I started thinking, I wonder what Richard Schechner would have thought about Donald Trump. And then I realized, of course, that Richard Schechner is not dead, which I knew. And so I ended up Googling to see if Richard Schechner had any words for Donald Trump, what he thought about him as a figure. And ironically enough, he has written an article called Donald John Trump, President, posted May 30th of 2017. I cannot get access to it, unfortunately. I have to pay for it, which I considered. But there is this sort of abstract or short summary of it, which is, Donald J. Trump, like it or not, is POTUS. This president is also a Caligula, a fool king, and a trickster. He is a performer rather than an actor, someone who inhabits his own narcissistic persona to an extreme degree, not someone who follows a prescribed script. His policies, executive orders, and appointments show he is cruel, dangerous, unpredictable, and entertaining. So we might have to read that at some point. But Richard Schechner has given sort of his opinion on performance and his thoughts about Donald Trump. Also a big part of performance, and luckily sort of Schechner is not too far behind in the years to sort of put this into his text, which is that the academic discipline of performance studies is emerging as a response to increasingly performative world. And his example is texting, right? This kind of writing that's very performative in a lot of ways. It's filled with complicated desires and emotions. And it can be read differently by people in different times and different situations. And we all sort of know that as people who text sort of on a daily basis, right? That we all sort of have that experience with maybe not understanding the text is the way it was supposed to have been read, or sort of experiencing sort of this misunderstanding between two people. So how do we see texting and social media? Is it a type of performance? How can we think about these things? And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some artists sort of later in the semester that investigate those things, excuse me. But you can think about emojis and different languages you use, right? The sort of acronyms and all these things. It's a completely different language and performance of its own. And you can play with these things in different ways than other people, and how you say things might interpret sort of how other people read your text messages, right? There are also some great examples of kind of performance in social media that have sort of come out. So something like this 2015 event of Asenya O'Neill, who was an Australian model and kind of an Instagram star and sort of influencer. She came out in 2015 and changed all of the captions on all of her images on Instagram, and saying that her posts were fake and that she put captions that really reflected how she was feeling, and said social media isn't real. It's purely contrived images and edited clips ranked against each other. It has consumed me. And so what she ended up doing is sort of posting all these different images, or they were already posted, but changing the captions on the images to say, this is not real life. I didn't pay for the dress, took countless photos trying to look hot for Instagram. The formal made me feel incredibly alone. Not real life. Only reason I went to the beach this morning was to shoot these bikinis because the company paid me, etc. And so as you look through all these images that she posted and changed the captions, you see sort of the desperation and the pain and the suffering that she sort of went through as she posted these things. And whether we knew not, we sort of believe her in that. Was this all a ploy to gain attention? And we're going to talk about an artist later in the semester who did create a fake Instagram as a type of performance. Do we believe her? Is this real? Is this not sort of another way for her to gain attention? Or was she serious about sort of feeling rejected by Instagram, and that she was having all of these sort of depressive issues because she had sort of sold her image to Instagram and had to be perfect in these particular ways? And it's easy to sort of believe because you could see it happening, right? You could see people sort of doing these things on Instagram, and you may feel that way too, even as you post on there, right? To pretend to be a particular way when you post on social media. Richard Schechner also talks about this idea of religion as performance, which I think is kind of interesting and doesn't necessarily speak to a negative connotation about religion, meaning that it's fake or sort of untrue, or that God is not a real thing, but a pretend sort of structure or idea. But in the fact that sort of the systems around it are very much sort of performance, right? The way that you sing in church, the way that you have a pastor or a priest give a speech or a sermon, right? So this sort of system that kind of all churches sort of inherit and carry through. You have this structure that carries sort of religious significance. And so sort of becomes this part of this whole sort of performance. As O.B. Hardison says from 1965, should church vestments then, with their elaborate symbolic meanings, be considered costumes? Should the paten, chalice, sinden, etc., be considered stage properties? Should the nave, chancel, presbyterium, and altar of the church be considered a stage, and its windows, statues, images, and ornaments a setting? So he's breaking down sort of these ideas about how all of these sort of churches and religious systems like Catholicism, which is what I'm going to show you a couple images of here, is all kind of part of this performance, right? This performance of doing the same sort of ritual action over and over again in sort of a very particular way. It kind of has a script, things that you're supposed to abide by, etc. So, for example, you can even think about the churches, right? You have here on the left Hagia Sophia and Church or Cathedral on the right. So you have sort of the way that people interact with the structures themselves. And then these structures have sort of performative nature, like these buildings. We talk about them in sort of early intro to art history, right? That the light comes through the windows. It's part of this performance of the structure and glitters off the gold at Hagia Sophia, this mosaic. As well as the stained glass windows in Chartres. You can also think a lot about relics and reliquaries. For example, again, like I said, the Catholic religion really focuses on this, which is a really interesting construct, right? Where you have these objects of priests, usually of saints or other religious figures, and you keep sort of their bodily remains or something that potentially had sort of a miracle connection to it. And they're used as sort of this object in the church that can perform miracles, or you sort of take it during events. So, for example, the bones of Mary Magdalene is in a basilica in France, and she goes and sort of travels as well during different ceremonies and events. So it becomes the performative nature of not only that these bones sort of carry this religious significance and these stories, but also used in sort of particular events, etc. You can also think of other type of relics and reliquaries, like the blood of Saint Januarius, which is a miracle where the dry blood of Januarius, a patron saint of Naples, is beheaded in the Roman Empire in 305, and then around like specific holidays, there's about 3 of them, September 19th, first Sunday of May, and then December 16th, you have the bringing out of this reliquary, and the blood needs to liquefy, bubble and liquefy, which is, right, a miracle, right? This is not realistic for dried blood, right, that's hundreds of years old to become liquid again, but it sort of had this connection to the city. So if the Pope takes out the reliquary and the blood bubbles and becomes liquid, then the city is safe. If it doesn't, it's a sign of despair. The sort of most recent time that was kind of scary was in 1980 when it failed to liquefy, and almost 3,000 people died in an earthquake in southern Italy. So some people have sort of a very suspicious connection with something like this, and you can think about like Groundhog Day, and other days where people come and like think about the significance of these sort of ritual activities for the prosperity of a city. Ironically enough, I did see recently that on May 3rd, 2020, the blood of St. Januarius did liquefy in Naples even during COVID. So hopefully that is a good sign for all of us, or it isn't. I don't know how is it really going today. I don't know. But you can think about all of the different great reliquaries and relics. So reliquaries usually hold the relics, which could be the bodily remains of certain figures. So, for example, you have the Apostle Paul. His wrist bone is kept in this reliquary here, right, which is shaped like a hand and an arm to signify sort of the relic that is within it. And you can use something like this. Sometimes they take them around the city and bless people with them. So they sort of have this sort of holy value as well. Always my favorite to show students these really weird kind of relics and reliquaries that are used in sort of religious performances. You have the foreskin of Jesus Christ, very interesting, and then the umbilical cord of Jesus Christ as well here. So you have these sort of reliquaries and relics being used as sort of valuable objects in the church's performances. Richard Schechner also brings up the objects of church officials as sort of quote-unquote costumes, which is very interesting as well. You can think about the papal tiara and the different robes that they wear, as well as the sort of justitorial chair, where the Pope is carried around on this sort of sacred chair around the city in sort of his very specific garments. So all of these are sort of part of this performance and reenacting these ideas that are intrinsic to the Catholic Church, to the different faiths. You have the same thing going on with Muslims, with Christians, right? All of these sort of symbolic ways that they reenact their religion. So now one of the big main sections is sort of performance in art and art history and how we sort of start to think about it. And obviously there's performance artists and people who create performance art, and we're going to talk about them as well. But I want to sort of talk about other ideas first and delving into sort of art as a structure and museums as a structure, right? You have these museums that are sacred spaces. You have the way that people are supposed to behave in those museums. You have wall labels written particular ways to enforce particular dialogues amongst people, right? If you think wall labels do not have some sort of hidden agenda at times, or opinions or ideas, you look real closely and you see sort of how people can perform with these sort of objects and create their own dialogue. So Schechner talks about the objects in a museum. Objects in a museum are regarded as practices, events, and behaviors, not just objects or things. How a work interacts with those who view it, thus evoking different reactions and meanings, and how it changes meaning over time and in different contexts. John Mackenzie says, instead, objects are produced and maintained through a variety of socio-technical systems, overcoded by many discourses and situated in numerous sites of practice. So here you have sort of in a museum, these objects are functioning not only as art objects, but the way that people interact and participate with them. So you have to think about even an object in a museum has a sort of performance nature to it. To treat an object, work, or product as a performance, a painting, a novel, a shoe, or anything at all, means to investigate what that object does, how it interacts with other objects or beings, and how it relates to other objects or beings. Performances exist only as actions and interactions and relationships. So it is about the relationship of the viewer to the object in the museum and what that means as they sort of interact with one another. So an example of an artist sort of interacting with work that I'm going to give you here to sort of help you think about you as an individual or as an artist and how you interact with work is Kehinde Wiley. And hopefully you have some familiarity with him. He's a pretty famous artist. If you don't, you can definitely Google him. But he typically paints black men as well as black women now, in these sort of grand historical narrative paintings in which he brings people off the street and he paints them and sort of brings black people back into the historical and art historical dialogue, as well as putting them back on the walls of museum spaces. So I have a video here from the Metropolitan Museum, the Artist Project, in which Kehinde Wiley talks about these two paintings and the way that he's interacting with portraiture and this idea of portraiture and how he's much different from John Singer Sargent. So go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to post that link and then come back to the lecture here to continue our conversation. So in thinking about how Kehinde Wiley is interacting with different works and ideas, I also have this image by Gauguin, which is Day of the God from 1894. And Kehinde Wiley has recently produced an exhibition called Tahiti, Kehinde Wiley, in which Kehinde Wiley has looked at the work of Gauguin and sort of rethought it and rewritten it. So Gauguin originally sort of is investing in this modernist idea of primitivism and paints this, right, quote-unquote exotic beauties for colonial French audience. And Gauguin is kind of obsessed with this community and kind of makes these women individuals into kind of sexual objects. And this Mau's community is a group classified in traditional Polynesian culture as being a third gender that exists between male and female. And so there's a lot of ideas about colonial exploitation in Gauguin's work, and feels very sort of objectified in a lot of ways. And so instead, what Kehinde Wiley has done here, which happened just this last year in 2019, so the year before now, was to create a series of paintings in which he went to this area in Polynesia and painted these figures in sort of their true glory. So asked them questions about how they wanted to be represented, and reimagine them and rethink them outside of this very sort of objectified dialogue that exist because Gauguin has painted it this way. So Kehinde Wiley goes and paints these people sort of how they want to be depicted, asks for their input, and creates these sort of massively gorgeous paintings of them as individuals. So Kehinde Wiley enacts with Gauguin's work and rethinks it in his own way to sort of give power back to these people. And this is very much part of sort of what globalization and these ideas that Schechner's talking about, as the current means of culture interaction enacts extreme imbalances of power, money, and access to media and control over resources, which is very reminiscent of colonialism and primitivism. This idea that a lot of these performances, when you start thinking about these things and thinking about how globalization exists, there's very much a separation between us and them and who is privileged and not privileged. Schechner says something about English language is spoken by many people in many countries and has become in many ways a quote-unquote global language. Is this a good thing, right? If you think about this sort of globalization of encouraging the English language, does that then give Americans the sort of right to feel some sort of that they're better than everybody else because their language is the one that's spoken, or is it because Americans are sort of too stuck in their ways to kind of evolve and try to speak other languages? And it's a very interesting way the United States operates. Richard Schechner asks, is globalization the equivalent of Americanization, right? Is this a problem with the United States that there's a globalization of the English language? And then what does that then mean for sort of power structures? Does it show that America thinks it's better, behaves as though it's better than all these other countries? Diane Taylor even says, the US thinks greatly of itself, yet doesn't often think about other cultures or narratives. Is it a positive thing for Trump to say America first, right? Or is it selfish? Is it thinking of ourselves as a first world and everybody else as lesser? And this very much connects in with the Mercator projection, in which you have the way that the map is represented historically. So there's this kind of construct between maps versus globes. Maps are flattened to make them easier to read. However, the Mercator projection distorts the globe widely in favor of the Northern Hemisphere. So wanted to show how colonial powers would have wished the globes or maps to look. Now, he did create it for mariners, merchants, and the military because of the way that the compass works on the map makes it easier for sea travel, but of course very much sort of distorts the largeness of some of these powers, right? So it has the United States looking quite large when it isn't. So when you start looking at how the world actually looks, you're very sort of deceived by how big some of these spaces really are, right? The stretching out of the spaces has caused this great distortion, and then in our minds made different countries look more powerful than they really are, or even continents for that matter. For example, something like Africa, right, which is a massive continent, is made to look so much smaller than it really is, in sort of connection with the United States. So thinking about how small the United States is really in comparison with Africa as a continent. Schechner also talks about Arno Peters' map, in which it looks more unnatural because it gives up shape for size, showing more of the correct shapes, the correct sizes instead of the correct shapes. But so each sort of map, as you move through these structures, kind of has its own reason for creation and sort of enacts power relationships in particular ways. So the way we interact with maps and these kind of other historical documents kind of influences the way that we think about ourselves. There are obviously objects in museums that are completely different, like something like Felix Kazan's Taurus's Untitled, which we'll probably talk about more when we talk about AIDS protesting, because he was a figure in the AIDS community at the time who lost his lover to AIDS-related illnesses, which is Portrait of Ross here in LA, in which Kehinde is slowly taken away by the visitors and is supposed to be kept originally at the ideal weight of 175 pounds. And as Ross Laycock sort of died, he got lighter and became smaller. And so the taking of the Kehinde is you partaking in sort of this breakdown of his body, and then sort of symbolizes this cycle of life and death. However, it is replenished back to 175 pounds, sort of to think about his constant life cycle and kind of giving him a rebirth in the museum space. So something that you would perform with a little more specifically, that kind of actually is a performance physically. I like that Schechner brings up some ideas about cultural objects as well. When you come with your own sort of preconceived ideas about cultures and art and bring that to performances, this can be a cause of limitations to you as an individual self. So ritual objects of one culture or one historical period become the artworks of another culture or period. Museums or art are full of paintings and objects that once were regarded as sacred and still may be pillaged to peoples eager to regain their ritual objects and sacred remains. So thinking about something like Benin Heads, where you have people going in and colonizing this space in Africa and taking these objects and talking about them, proving that the African culture is primitive and that they believe in decapitation, when really they're these performative heads that are supposed to be of rulers that have passed, and purposely done in this much more idealized imagery, not trying to make people look like they have specific features, right? More idealized, not supposed to look like anyone specific. So, as well as thinking about performance and sort of the avant-garde and today's establishment, what's new, original, shocking, or avant-garde is mostly either a different combination of known or the displacement of behavior from where it is acceptable or expected to a venue or occasion where it is not expected. For example, nudity in performing sphere when it appears in the 1960s, particularly because shown in art communities. Western art didn't want to recognize overtly sexual art, but you have other cultures and museums and communities where this is much more normal, much more respected and part of art. So as art sort of becomes today's establishment, right, you have more things sort of subverting the norm, like sexuality, etc. So these sort of overt moments and ideas become sort of today's establishment, right? So even these crazy avant-garde moments eventually become sort of part of our everyday understanding of art and art history, and then we have something else that sort of terrifies us or startles us or makes us rethink art as a whole. So Schechner does sort of briefly touch on what is not performance and what is not performance art, and he doesn't necessarily sort of give you any real clear answer. which is that he says there's this is versus as, right? There are limits to what is performance, but just about anything can be studied as performance. There's nothing inherent in an action in itself that makes it a performance or disqualifies it from being a performance. From the vantage of the kind of performance theory I'm propounding, every action is a performance. But from the vantage of cultural practice, some actions will be deemed performances and others not, and this will vary from culture to culture, historical period to historical period. At the end of the spectrum, it's clear what a performance is, what an artwork is. At the other end of the spectrum, no such clarity exists. So, of course, he tells us, well, some things are not performance, but really there's not a whole lot of clarity, right? If you're willing to study it and think about it as a performance, then it is a performance. And this last section here, focusing on Schechner, is performance as activism, right? And Schechner really kind of invests in this a lot and brings in these other sort of figures and scholars to talk about it. Performance studies call into question the privilege of academic authority by including all members of speech community as potential artists, all utterances as potentially aesthetics, all events as potentially theatrical, and all audiences as potentially active participants who can authorize artistic experience. By rejecting canonical security and exclusionary conventions, performance studies practitioners eschew artistic imperialism in favor of aesthetic communication. These claims then yield an ideology that is racially democratic and counter-elitist. In creating these performances, when you have performance artists creating them in the 1960s and 70s, you have them trying to break down some of these sort of elitist ideas about art and about the creation of art in museum spaces, and really sort of rethinking art as a whole. And that bleeds into our understanding of art and activism as well. Dwight Conquergood really talks a lot about these things in Richard Schechner's work. He cites him a lot. He wanted performance theorists to rethink 5 areas: performance and cultural process, performance and ethnographic praxis, performance and hermeneutics, which is the theory and methodology of interpretation, like an interpretation of biblical texts, performance of scholarly representation, and the politics of performance. In 1999, in his talk at the Cultural Intersections Conference at Northwestern University, he talks about the 3 A's of performance studies: artistry, analysis, and activism, and the C's, creativity, critique, and community. And by community, he means citizenship and civic struggles for social justice. And he talks about these 3 other sort of features of performance. And the one I'm really looking at is application, right? Not only sort of the making of art and culture and the interpretation, but application, right? Activism, connection to community, social context, really rethinking society and what it means. And performance really questions these sort of long-held power structures. Is gender really as straightforward and black and white as male and female? Are these constructs realistic? And if not, if they really aren't part of, if we really can't think about ourselves in black and white, then how do we need to perform and think outside of those things? So the politics of performance, right? What is the relationship between performance and power? How does performance reproduce, enable, sustain, challenge, subvert, critique? What kinds of knowledge are privileged or displaced when performed experience becomes a way of knowing, a method of critical inquiry, and a mode of understanding, right? How do you break down and start rethinking social issues through performance theory, and how people actually live versus how the social structures tell people to live? A field of performance studies is sympathetic to the avant-garde, the marginal, the offbeat, the minoritarian, the subversive, the twisted, the queer, people of color, and the formerly colonized. The values of ideas that feel natural are not natural or God-given at all, but the values that guide people are not natural, transcendent, God-given, or inalienable, despite the claim of the Declaration of Independence. Values belong to ideology, science, the arts, religion, and other areas of human endeavor. Values are hard-won and contingent, changing over time according to social and historical circumstances. Values are a function of cultures and groups and individuals. Values can be used to protect and liberate or to control and oppress. In fact, the difference between what is liberty and what is oppression depends a lot on where you're coming from. So as we start to think about what performance is and who performance artists are, we start to see the breakdown of these sort of social structures that people have put in place to control, to impress, to treat people as though they're lesser, right? So when you start realizing that these social structures exist other places, you start to realize how much they're sort of ingrained into our society, right? And what that means to sort of individuals.